Good morning, District 200 staff. It is really, really good to see you all, albeit not being all together. I am excited for us to be together this morning to learn and get better and reflect. And so, as we get together this morning, I want to start really, really with a thank you. So on the call today, we actually have 15 buildings represented. We have a full virtual academy. We've got an early childhood center, and we've got 13 in-person elementary schools. And so I just want to start with a thank you. You all are tremendous. Think about what you've done for our kids this year, no matter what the environment. How you're serving our families and students is tremendous. And certainly you stepped up and answered the call. So I'm incredibly thankful as somebody who gets to work with our K-5 levels and our early elementary levels. So just thank you for all you're doing. You need to know that you're doing great work. Little context for this morning. So if we go all the way back to the fall of 2019, we actually did some training of about 150 to 200 staff members on trauma-informed work, and really understanding how adverse childhood experiences impact brain development, impact behavior, and how really connecting and providing a safe environment is what the greatest combat to that is. And we furthered that work in our buildings last year, and long and behold, we know that adverse experiences and trauma impacts our kids, right? And then COVID came. And so COVID is certainly a new trauma all in itself. So this learning opportunity this morning focuses more on the trauma that this pandemic's brought. But I think the message that we're going to hear this morning, what we're going to learn, is not only about taking care of ourselves and how that can impact our own self wellness, but also how we can take care of our students and ultimately become more resilient as a result of this. And so we have a phenomenal presenter today. And his name is Dr. Doug Bolton. I'm going to just tell you a little bit about him before we turn it over to him. So Dr. Bolton's worked in therapeutic schools for 10 years as a school, 10 or more years as a school psychologist before spending the next 14 years as principal of North Shore Academy, which is a K-12 public therapeutic school in the North Shore of Chicago. Dr. Bolton's work in schools is focused on helping students identified with social and emotional disabilities to co-create a vibrant and connected school community that enables them to overcome their challenges and to more fully engage in their home, school, and local community. Dr. Bolton currently maintains a private practice and consults to schools who are wanting to enhance their ability to support their students with mental health issues. Through keynote addresses, professional development workshops, and individual consultations to teachers and students, Dr. Bolton empowers educational teams to create school communities that foster resilience for our most vulnerable students. So as we get started today, just a reminder, this is being recorded so that we can share this link out at another time as well. But I am really thrilled to turn it over to Dr. Doug Bolton.
Thank you, Chris. It's really so good to be here, and I've so appreciated working with you and the care and thought that you've put into organizing this day. So, I think I was about 2 months into this new world of ours. I think it was April or maybe May, when I started wondering, I wish there was somebody who could help me chart a path through this, but nobody has been through COVID in generations. And so I started thinking, and I realized I wish my grandmother was still around to speak with. She was born in 1899 and she passed away about 30 years ago. But when I started thinking about her life, I started thinking, I'll bet she could help me understand a path through this. When she was just 15 years old, World War I hit. And then just 2 years after that, there was a polio outbreak, and how frightening that must have been for parents and kids. And then just 2 years later, we know about the Spanish flu. 675,000 Americans died. Between 50 million and 100 million people died globally. Just tragic. What a hard stretch of time for her. But then what came next? The Roaring 20s, right? Isn't this a great picture of her? So, and during that time, she ended up meeting my grandfather, Walt. And they had my dad, their only child, in 1929. But we also know what happens in 1929, don't we? The stock market crashed. And all of a sudden, they were plunged in the Great Depression. And what happened after that? World War II. And then, as if that wasn't enough, when they finally survived all of those traumas, she had suffered her own personal tragedy. My grandfather died suddenly of a heart attack. And yet, the thing about my grandmother was that when my parents divorced, she was the one who was the rock. I had no idea she lived through all this. She was the one who took care of us. She had a real way with kids, didn't she? I love this picture. I said to they sent me a picture of Graham and a couple of us, and this is the one he sent. So this is the one you get, but she was actually really good with all of us. But what do we call that generation of people who lived through 2 world wars, a depression, and a pandemic? We call them the greatest generation. And the 1950s were a time of one of the greatest economic booms in history for our country. And so it made me wonder, I wish I could ask, what made you resilient so I can understand what makes us resilient? How can we cultivate resilience in our children? And is it possible that we can not just cope, but thrive as they did? The thing about coronavirus is that this is a collective trauma. There aren't that many traumas that impact us worldwide. And when we think about trauma, these are the 3 things that are the way that we can best support kids and each other through trauma. One is how we attach, how we connect with one another. It's incredibly healing. The second is trauma dysregulates everything in our physical bodies and in our emotional bodies. And so can we be regulated? Can we help kids regulate? And finally, I believe that the one thing that helps kids most is community, an attached and regulated community. And there's no better place to create that community that helps buffer and heal trauma than a school community, because nobody has kids for 30 hours a week, for 40 weeks a year, for 13 years. So that's the opportunity, right? And so if there's anybody who's at the heart of helping kids navigate this time through this trauma, it's you in your classrooms with your students, creating community. In order to do that, we need to manage our own stress, right? The second thing we'll talk about is how do we take care of our kids? And then the third is how do we make this work as educators? What does this look like? So the thing about COVID is they call it the novel coronavirus, and it certainly is. We haven't experienced anything like this in generations. It's constant. We never know when we are transmitting or getting the disease. There's economic insecurity that's constant for many people. There's an intensity. People are dying in numbers that are just so unnerving and frightening. People are losing their jobs, and each of you has had to completely change how you parent, completely change how you teach. It's been enduring. Anybody else, like on March 13th, when they said you've got to close everything down until April 7th, think, how am I going to make it till April 7th? Right? And here we are on the verge of February. And we still don't know exactly when life will go back to normal. And then, as we talked about before, there are very few stresses that touch everybody in the globe, around the globe. David Brooks, the commentator and columnist, said, if coronavirus is the earthquake, then our racial and social and political upheaval is the hurricane that came after. Each of us has our own relationship to all of these things, but each of these things impacts us in an incredibly personal way. It's an extraordinary time with extraordinary stresses, but I also think there's extraordinary opportunity for all of us during this time. All right, how do we understand and cope with the stress? So one of the things that's pretty well known is what happens with stress is it pushes us into lower brain, and we don't think as well when we're in lower brain, right? It triggers our fight, flight, and freeze response. And at the basis of this is a very primitive system, coping system. It's called the autonomic nervous system. And there's only two branches to this system. There's the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. The sympathetic nervous system triggers our stress response. It triggers our fight, flight, freeze response. The parasympathetic nervous system is what returns us to homeostasis. Only two paths. It's like a train. You can't be on two train tracks at the same time, right? You're either in stress response or returning to homeostasis. One is off when the other is on. And what it's meant to do is respond to real and immediate threats. That's what fear is. It triggers that response so we can act in those moments, right? And what's supposed to happen is our stress response goes up. Someone cuts us off in a car. We run from the grizzly bear. We get safe. And then we go back to homeostasis, right? Every multi-celled organism has a system like this. That's how primitive this system is. But there's something interesting that happened with evolution. Is on top of that system, they put this incredibly complex prefrontal cortex, that thing that's in charge of so much of our modern day thinking. And what it allowed us to have, it gave us the gift of anxiety. So if fear is our response to a real and immediate threat, anxiety is our response to thoughts about potential threats. Does this make sense? You know, your dog doesn't worry about what's going to happen 3 months from now, right? But we can time travel. This is one of the things our cortex allows us to do. It allows us to wonder, oh, what's going to happen to my daughter who's a senior in high school? She can't visit the colleges she was going to visit. What's going to happen to her college experience? What's going to happen in my classroom if my kids don't make the progress they typically make? What's going to happen to my parents in the nursing home if they don't get the virus in time? All of these things are things that this cortex allows us to think about and worry about. And we're also mind readers. We're constantly wondering, aren't we? How are my students doing? I wonder how my children are feeling. I wonder if my supervisors are happy with my performance. I wonder if this parent is going to be mad at me, right? We're constantly wondering about what other people are thinking. And the bottom line is that we're really bad at both. But our body responds as if these beliefs are true. These things trigger our stress response, don't they? And so with all of the different stressors, typically with our daily stresses, we've figured out how our stress goes up and goes down. But with so many new stresses, with so many things we're dealing with, it doesn't have a chance to go back down. So why do we have this anxiety? Well, it's protective. The thing about anxiety is it kind of like gives us a map of the minefield saying, look at all the things that could possibly happen. That's what it does. But the problem is it's often wrong. Does anybody else have their smoke detector right outside of their kitchen? My smoke detector has probably gone off 100 times since it was installed, and never, ever have I had a fire in my house. This is how anxiety is supposed to work. It's not supposed to be accurate. It's not supposed to go off only if the thing that we're worried about happens. It's supposed to warn us of all of these things. These thoughts are not irrational. The things we worry about are not irrational, but they're just not true. The thing is, our body responds as if they are. And so it triggers our stress response. And during that time, we lose the tools we need the most. We're not as good at listening. It's harder for us to be creative when we're in that lower brain place. We're not as flexible. We don't have the same amount of empathy for other people. Our memory is more compromised. It's harder for us to find the words, or the words we find may not be the right words, or maybe our tone of voice may change, right? And we lose the inhibition. We're more impulsive. You know, one of the things that happened before this, I asked Chris to go get his brain scanned, and this is what his brain has looked like in coronavirus. You know, you'd say the bald and everything, right? That's Chris's brain. We all feel a little bit like this, don't we? And I think what everybody's experiencing is we're not the same teachers, and we're not the same parents as we were a year ago. We can't show up in the same way as friends or as spouses, and we don't have the same energy or focus or motivation or optimism. All of these things have made us different, right? So what we need to do in order to capture our full brain as best we can and to re-engage as best we can is we got to manually override our autonomic nervous system. We need to switch the train tracks, right? So that we spend more time in homeostasis so we can have that wonderful full brain of ours more available. So how do we do that? So exercise, movement. We don't have to train for a marathon, but making sure we have movement. One of the things that happens when we have that, all of the adrenaline and other things from the fight, flight, or freeze, if we don't have expression for that, it can be very problematic for us. And so finding expression for that, going for a walk, even if it's cold, finding a way to exercise, even if it's for 10 or 15 minutes, it's really important. Diet is incredibly regulating for us or can be dysregulating. I always think diet, the battle with diet is in the grocery store, not in the kitchen. And that's one of the things I've really needed to be intentional about. I'm not sure about any of you, but I've really struggled to sleep over this time in a way that I don't typically. And the key thing is to have good sleep hygiene so that we're making sure we don't fall into bad sleep habits, but really being clear that sleep is so valuable for us. Hobbies. One of the things that hobbies do is they can help us feel productive as this whole world and as our jobs have changed. It helps us feel productive, whether it's be completing a crossword puzzle or doing a woodworking project or a scrapbook, whatever it may be. These things are important. One of the things that I bet you found is that routines are really helpful. Your routines and your routines for your students. And one of the things that happens in the brain with routines is we can't predict. There's so much we can't predict about when this is going to be done. But one of the things that routines do is they allow us, it gives us comfort. It allows us not to feel so much stress when we know what's coming in the next 10 minutes, when we know what's coming. We know what's coming when the class period ends. We know what's coming in this new routine of going and having lunch, making sure there's routines and they help you and they'll help your students. And one of the things that is so important is connection. And we know that. But finding ways to connect with kids, even if they've got masks on, their connection to us and to them is going to be trickier. Let's find ways of connecting. And outside of this, making sure that the connections that you're losing because you can't see people as much, because it's harder to organize time together, making sure you're investing in connections that are going to be fulfilling. We all have our regulation strategies, right? And it's easy for us to let those go in how hard this is. It could be reading, it could be reading, it could be gardening. You know, can you have an indoor garden? It could be, you know, whatever it is that helps you calm, talking to a friend, having a glass of wine with your spouse, playing games with your kids, whatever that is, making sure that that happens. One of mine is I like to take walks along the lake. I live in Evanston, so I take walks along the lake. And this morning, this is the look this morning. And I was thinking, I don't have time to do that. I've got to practice this some more. I've got to tweak it some more. And I thought, no, this is going to help me be more present. So making sure you're engaging in those regulation strategies that have sustained you up until now. Don't let those go. I'm sure you've heard about all this, but the research on mindfulness and breathing, it's as good as taking any kind of medication for anxiety and depression. There are great apps for this, but what mindfulness does is it shuts down that time traveler. It shuts down that mind reader and helps us just be present in this moment. And the interesting thing about breathing is, have you ever noticed that under stress, we breathe much more shallowly and we'll keep it in our chest? And then when everything's over, what do? We exhale, right? We breathe a sigh of relief. One of the things that's interesting is there are nerve endings on our lungs. And when we can breathe, especially our exhale, it triggers the rest of our physical body to say, we're okay, because we can't exhale like that if we're being chased by a grizzly bear. So it can reroute what's happening in our brain's anxiety to let the whole body know you're safe. I love the research on gratitude. I've had a lot of teachers say to me, this is the one thing that was a difference maker. There's a great study, it's really robust, the impact of gratitude on anxiety and depression. The one that I like the most is they had people writing 3 items of gratitude in a gratitude journal every night for a week, just 3. And it wasn't like, I'm grateful that I have a job, I'm grateful to have a roof over my head. I'm grateful to have a loving family. No, it's discrete moments from that day. I'm grateful that that parent reached out and let me know how much they appreciate what I'm doing. I'm grateful that my kids were laughing and giggling instead of arguing this morning at breakfast. I'm grateful that that person let me in front of them when they saw I was in a hurry in the grocery store. Those little moments of gratitude, right? And they stopped, just 21 incidents of gratitude in a journal. Then they stopped, they did nothing for 6 months. And when the researchers came back, these people who did 1 week of gratitude journaling were still showing lower levels of anxiety and depression than the people who didn't. Can you include gratitude into your life and your family's life, around the dinner table, in a journal? It's powerful. All right, would you take a pill that creates a misperception of risk, increases anxiety and learned helplessness and feelings of contempt and hostility and decreases your mood? We probably wouldn't take that pill, right? At some level, we're all taking that pill and we don't realize it. I like Lester Holt. It's not Lester Holt. It's absorbing news generally. This is what happens to us. We may not realize it, but our heart rate starts to change. Our breathing starts to change. All of these things happen. And it's not saying that we shouldn't be informed, because we need to be informed more than ever. But does anyone else, I saw this term and I'm like, this is me. I'm a doom scroller. Like, I'll just hop on my social media feed for a few minutes, and then all of a sudden I am deep into all the most disturbing articles I can find. And they like to throw it right at me, right? And 25 minutes later, again, I may not notice it, but my breathing is different. My heart rate is different. I feel differently about the world. And so what we got to do is we've got to curate what we're bringing in now more than ever. It doesn't mean that you need to shut it down altogether, but if there are sites that are more upsetting for you, or just limit the amount of time, but we need to be careful about what we're bringing in. And then I think for me, when this all hit, I left my job as principal. This was my first year. And all of a sudden, I was doing school consultations and schools closed. And I'm not a very apocalyptic thinker, but the streets were empty. And you'd walk through the grocery stores and the shelves were empty. And it was really unnerving for me. And I had all sorts of time to worry, right? And I said, as I was doing this work, I started realizing that the way people throughout history have begun to understand this is this concept of impermanence. The thing is that there are times during this when I feel like I've got this, right? Like things are going okay, we're doing okay. And things in my life when I felt like that. But it's only a matter of time before I'm upside down and the waves are crashing on me again, right? But then again, it's only a matter of time before I'm up and feeling okay. And this is what I realized, is there's never been a time that I felt great in my life, that there wasn't a time at some point later that I did feel upside down again. And there's never a time that I felt really, really down that it hasn't turned around. And it's not just in my life, it's in history, right? A world war and a pandemic led to the Roaring 20s. And then there was a world war and a depression that led to the greatest, led to the 1950s, the greatest economic decade to that time in US history. This is the way the world works. And so what we need to do is we need to surf. When things are really hard, we need to realize, okay, they will get better. And when things are right, it doesn't mean that we can say that when something bad happens, that it's not some cosmic plot against me, right? That this is just the way the world works. And so I guess the thing that we need to do is now more than ever, we need to be intentional. The things that you've done that sustained you in your lives until now, keep doing those. Make sure you don't let go of those. It's also a time, especially during this time of winter. And I think this is always a hard stretch in schools anyways. There may be some things you want to add. So take a look and be intentional about which of these things can you keep? Which of these things will you add? Okay, how do we support our kids and how do we rethink teaching? One of the things when we are in lower brain, when we're dealing with all of this change, there's going to be limitations on students' ability to learn. There's going to be limitations on our ability to teach, right? Our brains are not as available to this stuff, and we're needing to do everything differently than we ever have. There's all sorts of reasons why this is hard, but we worry. Will they learn enough? What are they going to learn, right? But I wonder, where is the opportunity in this? And I believe the opportunity is in teaching resilience, because the thing about resilience is you can't build resilience without experiencing stress. It's impossible. And also, one of the things about I would say the last 2 generations, especially this past generation, we have seen spikes in mental health issues in kids. You all have seen it. And I believe it's because kids are not as resilient as they used to be. And given all of the stress that they're experiencing now, this is our opportunity to teach them resilience. And not only will they learn resilience for this time, but this resilience is going to help them when they're in high school, isn't it? And it's going to help them when they're in college and in their jobs and in their marriages and in their parenting. This is the opportunity. So how do we do that? D.W. Winnicott had a great term. He called it the good enough mother. This is the 1940s, and there were all of these parenting theories that said you need to parent in exactly this way, and if you don't, your kid will not be successful. And what D.W. Winnicott said is that's not true. We just need to be good enough. We don't need to be perfect. And he said, babies and children will actually benefit when their mothers or fathers or teachers or coaches fail them in manageable ways. Because what happens when we fail them is they've got to respond, and they realize that they can take care of themselves in new ways. The other day, my daughter, it was actually last fall, she had been planning for the SAT. Every day she studied for about a year. And the morning of the SAT, she had her morning planned out in exactly the way she needed to keep herself regulated and ready to go. And she said, Dad, all I need is that I need the car by 7:30. And of course, I was down by the beach. I got her car back at 7:28, right? We pass in the hallway on her way out the door. And she comes and she leaves, and she comes back about 5 minutes later, and she says, Dad, there's no gas. I had failed her, right? And so her whole morning got thrown off. And I felt terrible, but you know what? She learned how to navigate when everything you plan, and happens to teachers all the time. Everything we planned we had it planned to the minute, and it didn't work. And it's going to be okay. And maybe she lost a couple points on her SAT test. She's going to be okay, right? These things happen when we forget to pick our child up at practice. That's going to be okay. When we become impatient with students in the classroom, when we lose our patience, it's okay, because they're going to see then how do we recover. So can we be good enough as a teacher, and we all be good enough as parents? One of the problems is we've got a loud inner critic, don't we? I think teachers have the loudest inner critic of anybody I know, right? Constantly feeling like I need to be perfect. And this is not a time when we can be perfect, is it? To me, this is the time when we just need to survive this storm. We are going to get pummeled by the waves of this. We are going to be wet and wrinkled, and our hair is going to be a mess, right? But as long as we end up holding hands with our students and our parents and our colleagues on this pier, we will have done it. And we will all be stronger because of it. What Brene Brown says, she says, sometimes the bravest and most important thing you can do is just show up. We don't need to be perfect with our students or with our kids. This is a time when we just need to show up. Dan Siegel, who I think is the person who's really leading the child development theories of this time, wrote a book with Tina Bryson called The Power of Just Showing Up. And so he talks about how do we show up as a parent, but I think it's also how do we show up as teachers. And he talks about not perfection, he talks about presence, how parental presence, how teaching presence shapes who our kids become and how their brains get wired. And they all start with S to make it easy for us to remember, right? So showing up is about helping kids feel safe and seen and soothed and secure. So safety is protecting them from harm. And you guys have worked so hard keeping them safe in school, right? When you went remote, it was keeping them safe remotely. This is all of our energy has been protecting them from physical safety. This is a picture of me with my mom and my little sister. And clearly there's not something out there that that's really dangerous, or else we'd leave, but I'm clearly concerned. And I like this because it feels to me like a metaphor of what we need to be doing for our kids, is providing psychological safety, letting them know that they're going to be okay, that this is our work during this time. And in order to do that, we need to avoid becoming the source of fear. And the mistake we make, and I'm not sure if you guys have made this mistake, but I've lost my temper with my kids more than I want to admit over this time. It's been hard. There are times when you may have been short with your students in a way you don't typically. This is a natural thing to happen during this time. And it's okay, as long as we then say, all right, I need to take care of myself more when these things happen, right? And we need to forgive ourselves, and we need to make it right. And the thing is, when we make it right, we're teaching our kids how to make it right. They are watching us, and they're learning how to make it right. When you blow a lesson, or when you're short with a student and you come back and say, boy, that must have felt, that might not, my tone of voice wasn't what I had hoped for. And so I want to apologize. The second is, can we help kids feel seen? And being seen is being attuned to their feelings, being curious, seeing life through their eyes. This is a strange time for us. I don't even know what it looks like through the eyes of a third grader, right? And so can we see this world as best we can through their eyes? One of the interesting things, one of the very core elements of our emotional development, we are hardwired as parents to mimic the faces of our kids, aren't we? Remember, and you guys may have some kids who are younger. Your kid makes a face and you mimic that face, don't you? It happens all the time. And what this is doing, when the child experiences something and their face changes, they get to see what their face looks like in our face. And in that, they begin to understand what it is that they're feeling, right? Some people take it too far. I don't think this is all that helpful, right? But at the end of the day, as kids get older, this is what it looks like. It's just being attuned and helping them know that their feelings are real, even if we could disagree with what their feelings are, even if we have a hard time understanding them, their feelings are real. And just like us, they're fleeting. Their waves come even quicker than our waves typically. But we make mistakes. We make the mistake of trying to fix it and take away their discomfort, right? And then they don't learn how to fix it themselves. We can minimize it. Why would you be worried about that? That's ridiculous. We've cleaned this place. You don't need to worry about this. And each of these in their own ways can be shaming. So what do we do instead? Well, we soothe. And again, these are all things, whether it's responding now to COVID or responding to other traumas. What soothing does is it helps kids return to homeostasis. I love this quote: when little people are overwhelmed by big emotions, it's our job to share our calm, not join their chaos. It can be unnerving when kids get upset, but can we share our calm with them? I like this term called holding space. And I like this picture. This child is clearly distressed. The mother is attuned, but not fixing, just being present. And ideally, we can help kids learn how to soothe themselves. With younger kids, it might be teddy bears or Legos. With older kids, it might be shooting baskets in the yard or putting their AirPods in. But we make mistakes here too. And the biggest mistake, I think, is that we punish instead of soothe. I love this picture. You can see the shame in his posture, can't you? Facing the wall with his head. He's on timeout, right? And instead of saying you need to take a timeout, you're bad. You've been bad. Make it right. What I'd rather have them say is take a look at who's with them. Charlie, the dog, is with them. I'd rather say you seem really upset, and I'm not helpful right now. Why don't you and Charlie go? And when you guys are feeling better, why don't you go to the bedroom or go downstairs? And when you're feeling better, come on back and we'll figure this out together. How can we make sure they're getting regulation breaks? But we get impatient, don't we? The thing is, if we give it time, almost everything gets better, doesn't it? We have this sense of urgency, but we need to give it time. And the interesting thing is all of these things are in development. They're going to get better at these things. And so we need to give it time, not just time in the moment. We need to realize they're going to be better at this when they're 18 than when they're 8. So showing up is helping kids feel safe and seen and soothed. And if we do that, then kids are going to feel secure. And it's that security that allows them to be resilient, to face the things in their life that they'd otherwise face. I saw this in a middle school bathroom, and I had to take a picture of it because I liked it so much. It is the definition of resilience. You have within you right now everything you need to deal with whatever the world can throw at you. And the world is throwing everything at our kids, and it's throwing everything at us. And what they're seeing is they're seeing you adapt. They've seen you go remote. They've seen you change everything about your practice to come back and be socially distanced. This is what they've seen. And they've seen themselves adapt and their parents adapt. That's what resilience is. It's that security that allows them to be resilient. In order to do that, we need to take care of ourselves. I know I'm beating a dead horse, but this is how we do it. We need to be intentional. And we need to realize that good enough really is good enough during this time. And that there's beauty in imperfection. In fact, there's power in imperfection, because when we're imperfect, kids learn and we learn, as long as we forgive ourselves and not let perfect be the enemy of the good, and then say, I'm sorry when we screw up. I love this quote by James Baldwin. Our kids are watching and they're learning from us. Children have never been very good at listening to their elders, but they've never failed to imitate them. They're learning from your instruction. Don't get me wrong. I think they're learning more by watching how you've coped with this. Nenea Hoffman says, note to self, all you have to do is show up, be late, be scared, be a mess, be weird, be confused. Just be there. You and your students and your colleagues and your family will figure out the rest as you go. All right, I'm going to take a breath. So everybody, if you could, you can stand up and stretch. Let's just take 30 seconds. I'm going to be quiet. We can stretch and just take a minute. I'm going to stand up and stretch. We're about the halfway point. All right. We all need a regulation break, don't we? All right. Next, we want to actually do a moment of mindfulness. So because we know that we can only really tolerate about 50 minutes at a time, you don't need a big break. Your kids are needing breaks. They don't need big breaks, but they may just need a stretch at different points in time. So I'm going to do a mindfulness exercise. This will take about maybe a minute. We're going to practice eye palming. Feel your feet flat on the floor and straighten your back. Close your eyes. Bring your palms together in front of your chest. Rub your palms together quickly. Listen to the sound of your hands rubbing together. Feel the heat and energy in your palms. Keep rubbing your palms together. Rub your palms together even faster. Keep your palms together, but stop rubbing. Now cup your hands and gently place your palms over your eyes with your fingertips resting at the top of your forehead. Notice the warmth and darkness. Feel your eyes relax. Feel your forehead relax. Feel your cheeks relax. Relax your entire face. Slowly lower your hands and rest them in your lap. Now take a deep breath in and hold, and exhale slowly. Notice how you feel. Now slowly open your eyes. The wonderful thing about mindfulness activities is, number one, in just a few minutes, it can reset us. Did anyone, I hope that you felt different before than you did after. The other thing with kids, especially in elementary school, is they're recognizing the difference. They're needing to assess what's happening in their bodies. And in doing so, it allows them to better understand how to regulate themselves. All right, how do we make this work? I've got 10 ideas for us, all right? And you're gonna get a copy of, if you want a copy, I'll give you guys a copy of the PowerPoint in case anybody wants it. The 10 ideas. And the first idea, the first strategy is that staff community is more important than ever. Being a regulated, connected place for yourselves is gonna sustain you so you can provide that to your kids. This quote by Margaret Wheatley, and this is the case for in any time with kids who have, especially for kids who've experienced trauma. When we're past all this still applies. It's possible to prepare for the future without knowing what it will be. The primary way to prepare for the unknown is to attend to the quality of our relationships, to how well we know and trust our colleagues, our students parents. This is the work. But we need to watch for it. There have been a lot of times when we felt like this, right? The place that I notice it in myself and other people is when people are starting to become dysregulated, I notice it in their flexibility and in their empathy. When we start saying things like, I don't care what they say, this is ridiculous, we can't do that. When we start getting that energy, I can't believe they didn't do that, whatever it is, when we get that energy, and we all get it at certain points in time, when we get that, it means we need a break. It doesn't need to be a long break, but it does mean we need a break, right? Your crazy is showing. You might want to tuck that back in. We need to tuck it back in more often during this time than we probably ever have. And so with intention, this is how we tuck it back in, right? But here's the thing. That one of the things that's hardest, I think, for teachers is, especially teachers who've been doing this a long time, you have your systems. Everything got thrown out the window. You've been doing things for years, and all of a sudden you've had to do things completely differently. You've had to learn an entire new platform for learning, right? You can't just go up to a student's desk anymore and lean over them and show them and share their pencil. There's a lot of things we can't do. The thing is that anything that's new triggers our stress response. It makes us anxious. And so you guys have been brave enough to be bad, and we're gonna need to continue to be brave enough to be bad. And can we have the mind of a learner instead of the mind of an expert? One of the interesting things is every time we teach a student a new concept, they are learning, they are incompetent at that, right? And so this is a really important time, I think, for all of us to recognize what it is like as we're trying to do new things, to recognize what is it like to be the mind of a learner and how wonderful and empowering, but also how frightening that is. I'm going to brag a little bit about my sister. She graduated in 3 years, valedictorian from high school. Graduated from Middlebury College, valedictorian. Graduated from Yale, got her PhD, valedictorian. Not a bad resume, right? Not about as much of an expert as you're going to get. She was a professor at Swarthmore College for 25 years. She still is. But last spring, when they told her she needed to teach a summer class that she'd been teaching for ages, for these students from under-resourced communities and families, they would come and have a soft landing at Swarthmore, right? And the whole key was helping them feel comfortable and feel a sense of belonging. And she said, I can't do that remotely. How am I going to be able to do that? I've never seen her feel so discouraged, so anxious. But one of the things she did was she said, she decided to interview each student. And she asked him, what's your superpower? And she told the story of this one guy, Jamal from the Bronx. And he said, yeah, my superpower is I'm a multitasker. I can be on this Zoom call. I can watch my 2-year-old sister. I can make lunch for my 8-year-old brother, and I can be working on the paper all at the same time. And she went around and she got all those. And it was interesting because instead of all of them walking into a nondescript classroom, all with their backpack on, Everybody was seeing into each other's lives in a way they wouldn't have otherwise. And you got to see into your students' lives, and they got to see into your lives when you were remote in ways that they never had before. And so all of a sudden, there was Jamal on the Zoom call with this 2-year-old strapped to the side of his head, right? Making lunch, still contributing. And at the end of this, she said she had made a collage out of electronic Post-its. And she said, what has this experience been like for you? Love is all we need. All sorts of love. She was worried they wouldn't come up with the belonging message. She couldn't create that community, but she did, right? She was brave enough to be bad, and you all were able to do the same thing, and you all are creating community in your classroom despite social distancing. Right, strategy number 2 is we need to steal like an artist. I love this term called positive deviance. Positive deviance refers to, in every community, there are people whose uncommon behaviors and strategies enable them to find better solutions to problems than their peers, while having access to the same resources and facing similar or worse challenges. The bottom line is there are some of you guys who've dealt with this better. Some of you who are able to engage kids in remote learning better than other people. There are some people who figured out the routines of their classroom quicker. There are some people who are able to help with transitions in a different way, right? Everybody is able to create things that they haven't, and some people are getting it quicker than others. There was an interesting research done. This is where I first heard about this. In Vietnam, there was 80% malnutrition, huge numbers of kids being malnourished in Vietnam in those communities. And so Harvard went in to figure out how can we help these kids who were malnourished. And instead of watching the 80% of the kids and working with the 80% of the families, they went and they watched the 20% who were thriving to see what are they doing and what are they doing differently with the exact same resources. And what they found was there were subtle things. When they were in the rice fields, they were collecting these tiny shrimps, and they were collecting these sweet potato leaves, and they were putting them in the stew. Everybody made the same kind of stew for dinner. The other thing they observed was that that the families for the kids who were thriving were serving the stew differently. They were digging deeper where all of the nutrients were instead of taking from the top. And the interesting thing was they didn't then go and create a pamphlet to say this is how you do this to the 80% of kids who were malnourished. They had the people from the villagers whose kids were thriving teach the other people how to do this. And after just 12 weeks, they saw a 66% reduction in malnutrition. So here's the thing. I think as teachers, we need to do it differently. Positive deviance is like a flashlight. It helps us discover what already exists. Teachers are remarkably humble. But here's the thing. If you've got an idea that's working, it's important that you share it with other people. This is how innovation works. You're all dealing with new challenges. Some of you are coming up with ideas that other people haven't had. Share those. And also, it's time to be more humble. That when something isn't working, look around. If someone's got an idea, if some kids are making transitions better than yours, see, hey, can I watch your transition? I want to see what you're doing that I'm missing. These are some of the things that we can do. All right, strategy number 3 is we've got to MacGyver this thing. The beautiful thing about MacGyver is he was able to take normal things and reconfigure them to get out of all sorts of jams, save all sorts of lives, right? And what he did is he never got stuck with functional fixedness. And functional fixedness is the inability to think about or use an object in a way other than the way it's commonly used. An example of this, my favorite example is I saw in the movie from Apollo 13. It was a real story. One of the things that happened for Apollo 13, they were going to the moon to collect samples for research to bring back down. And on their way, there was an explosion. I'm sure many of you saw the movie. There was an explosion in the air filtration system. And all of a sudden, they were running out of oxygen, and the temperature was plummeting. All sorts of things were threatening. not just their mission, but their lives. And so the first thing they needed to do was they needed to redefine the mission. The mission was no longer, can we make it to the moon? The mission was, we've got to get these people down safely, right? And they landed and they all survived. The same thing is true for us in this time, I think, is that there is an importance to teaching content, don't get me wrong. But this is a time when we can teach resilience. When we redefine the mission, not only is this going to help them now, it's going to help them in their future. And this is our opportunity to teach them this. There's never been a better opportunity to teach them resilience. And the second thing they did was they needed to redefine their resources. Some of you, if you saw the movie, will remember this scene. They had to fix this thing before they landed. And so what they did was the people on the ground said, what do they have access to on that spacecraft? And they came in and they put it all on a table. And this guy says, this round air filter was blown up. The only thing we can replace it with is this square filter. How are we going to put that square filter in the round filter? And they used things from their spacesuit, and they used duct tape and people's socks and manuals. They used the covers from the manuals, and they jerry-rigged something. And then they told the people, the astronauts, how to do it. And this is the actual repair that they made. So what does that mean for us as educators? This is an opportunity. Do we need to redefine our class period? What happens in our class period? Do we redefine our assignments? Do we redefine how much homework we give to kids? One of the things that we know, one of the benefits in the spring, parents would come to me and teachers would come to me and say, there's less homework with all this remote learning. And parents would say, we're so much more relaxed at home. And the kids are so much more relaxed going to school. And teachers would say, I don't have all this grading. Everybody's more regulated. There's a balance between providing all this homework and being regulated so everybody can have their brains available, right? Are there things that we've learned from that? Our partnerships with parents have changed, haven't they? Parents and our partnerships with things like our student council and our PTAs. We can do remote learning. Will there ever be another snow day? I don't know, right? One of the things that happened for my daughter, she's in addition to being late for her SAT test, she was working with this community agency and people from her high school to figure out how do we reduce the racial achievement gap in Evanston. And when COVID hit, she realized there's an opportunity here. We've got all sorts of elementary school kids who they're worried about, especially the kids who are in the least resourced homes. So she and her classmates, 3 of them, created this tutoring program. There's the website. They recruited 100 other of their classmates to become tutors for elementary school kids. And they're still tutoring those kids because Evanston is all still remote. And sure enough, they solved all sorts of problems. They solved academic issues, but there was also a sense of purpose, not just for them, but for the kids. They all connected. They all benefited from that connection. And they all experienced this generosity that is so important to being able to get through this really hard time. If we only saw them as students, we never would have imagined them as teachers and tutors, right? How can we rethink student council now? We don't need booster clubs to raise money anymore for sports teams. Maybe this spring we do, but are there other ways that we need to raise money to be able to support members of our community? Are there ways that we can rethink all the resources that we have? Look at how our classrooms looked in 1920. Remarkably similar to how they look now. I think that if we can rethink all of these things, the lessons we're going to learn from this time will transform what our classrooms look like in the future. The interesting thing about all the pandemics that I'm aware of is that following the pandemic, there was economic growth and artistic revolution and social progress. The bubonic plague, the biggest pandemic that we've ever experienced that lasted a decade, led to the Renaissance and the end of the feudal system. The Spanish flu led to the Roaring 20s and ruined suffrage. Crisis and creativity creates transformation. This is our opportunity. Can we take advantage of it? What will we create in our schools for kids? What will our schools look like in 2030 based on all that we're learning now that this pandemic has forced us to do things differently? Strategy number 4 is we need to address the stress. The 4 things that make stress particularly hard is when it's unpredictable and uncontrollable, when we can't access our support or express our distress. We already talked about how important predictability is, how that can return us to homeostasis if we know what's coming next in the next few moments. Well, control is the same way. Even though we don't have control over when we get our vaccination, even though we don't have control over when we're gonna be able to not wear a mask anymore, and when we don't need to social distance. One of the things that they found is having control over things in the here and now also helps return us to homeostasis. Having control over what an assignment may be, having control over whatever, whether they use a pen or a pencil, whatever, all of these little moments of control, the more we can give them choice, the more they can return to homeostasis. They actually did a study of a nursing home where they had nursing home people, they gave some people the choice of what they wanted for dessert and what movies they were going to watch at night. The others, they didn't give them the choice. And the people who had the choice actually lived longer because their stress response wasn't as active. They spent more time in homeostasis. Whether you're in person or not, with masks, it's harder to connect, isn't it? It's important that we continue to try and find ways to connect. And with our kids who are still remote, making sure that we are conferencing with them, that we're checking in, that we're attuned to what they're happening. It may take a little time out of instruction, but knowing where they're at, knowing how regulated they are, knowing how they're feeling will help you then gear your instruction in a way that will make them more available. And for the kids who haven't shown up, or the kids who you feel disconnected with, send them a postcard. Find a way of connecting. I'll tell you what, I'll bet you if your student sent you a postcard, you'd find it in your desk when you retire. And the same thing is true. I'll bet you if you send a kid a postcard, even if they don't respond, it's going to be in their drawer when they leave for college or when they leave home. And this is an opportunity to connect with parents in ways we never have before. You guys have partnered with parents. I have never heard parents speak so highly of their teachers. And I know that there is a vocal minority of people out there, parents who are very anxious and worried, and they take that out on all of you. And I get that, but I guess what I want to say is I think that our relationships with parents that are cultivated during this time are going to help parents understand and recognize that their partnerships with their schools are going to be much more positive than they've ever been before, because they've seen how hard you work, they've seen how hard you care, they've seen inside of your homes, you've seen inside of their homes. And finally, in our instruction, can we share stories about coronavirus? One of the things is humans think in stories, and we try and make sense of the world by telling stories. This is how our brains work. Can we make sense of the world together by telling our stories of COVID, the things that we're grateful for, the surprising things we're grateful for, and the things that are hard for us? The more they can talk about these things, the more they're going to make sense of this thing that it's really hard to make sense of, the more your school community will begin to make sense of this time. Number 5 is, can we find the orchids? Tom Boyce does research on resilience, and he's an amazing guy. He would take saliva samples to see just how stressed kids were from preschool all the way up through high school, and then he would follow them and track them and see which kids were able to withstand which stresses and which traumas. And what he found, he said, it's all really pretty remarkably clear that there are dandelions and there are orchid kids. He said the dandelion kids are kids who can survive just about anything. They can grow up through concrete. They can survive a thunderstorm. Orchid kids, though, they're more sensitive to their environment. You need the right light, don't you? You need the right temperature. The soil needs to be just right. You can't overwater an orchid. And yet, when we do that right, It's amazing how beautiful those flowers can become. And what he said is that 80% of kids are actually dandelion kids. And I think we found that most kids, even though we thought this would be so incredibly hard for them, they've been able to navigate this beyond our expectations. Teachers have often said, I'm surprised at how well they're doing this. I think we've been underestimating our students for a long, long time. Resilience is the norm. It's not the exception. And I'm not saying that they aren't having a hard time, but they are coping and they are adapting. And he said 20% of the kids are orchid kids. The interesting thing about this time, I think that we found some different kind of kids. Some kids do better with remote learning, don't they? Some kids, when you take away the social and complexities, all the complexities of going into a school building, actually show up and are more engaged online. And there are some kids who are falling apart and really struggling. Those are the kids we need to engage with, right? Those are the kids we don't need to worry about all kids, but let's notice and be attuned to the kids who are really hurting. And let's put our resources there. One of the things that we often do as parents and educators is we just assume, oh, they're not showing up. Their parents don't seem to care. They're not supportive. They're not, there's all sorts of things that we say. But if we ask, it's amazing the things that we'll find out. I had a high school teacher who said, I've got 95% of my kids are showing up. I've got one kid that's not showing up for my English class. And I knew he wouldn't. This is in the spring. He says, I knew they wouldn't. Because he just wanted to use the cop out of the, do no harm grading. He's going to graduate. He's fine. So he reached out a couple times, but that was it. 6 weeks later, the kid reaches out and says, I haven't been around and I'm sorry I haven't been in touch. It's been hard for me to get out of bed. My best friend took his own life. My father lost his job and I just don't know what to do. And this teacher, who's in charge of the wellness in his high school, said, I can't believe I missed that. There's a story when kids are struggling. Can we be curious about that story? Can we find meaning in this time, meaning in this stress? All right, by 10:30, within the next hour, I'll be done before 10, don't worry. But in the next hour, if I do this right, your life expectancy will increase by 43%. Not bad for a in-service day, right? How can that be? And you're going to feel a greater sense of power and pride and strength. And you're going to have higher pain tolerance, greater self-control, more empathy, and greater connection. Not bad, right? And that's all in the next 15 minutes. The key thing is finding meaning in stress. They did this survey. If you had to sum up how you feel about stress, which statement would be more accurate? Stress is harmful and should be avoided at all costs, or stress is helpful and should be accepted and utilized and embraced? It turns out that 85% of Americans believe that stress has a negative impact on our health, family life, and work. And I was one of those. But in 1997, they asked these questions to 30,000 people. 2 questions. How much stress have you experienced in the last year? Was the first question. The second question is, do you believe that stress is harmful to your health? And the bad news is that 8 years later, they went back and they found, and all they did was check records to see who was alive and who died. And what they found is that the people in the high stress and stress is harmful condition were at 43% greater risk of dying. But there's very good news here, and that is that in the high stress, same amount of stress, but the people who felt that stress wasn't harmful had a 0 increased risk of dying. And if you believe stress isn't harmful, it's even better than people in the low stress condition, right? This is a key. What they found is that there's a self-fulfilling prophecy that believing that stress is helpful makes stress helpful. Believing that this stress is helping us be more resilient will make us healthier. Our beliefs about stress are more important to our health than our actual stress. I didn't make this up. Kelly McGonigal, it's a great book, The Upside of Stress. And what she had us do, the readers do, and what I'm going to have you do right now is I want you to think about a time in your life that was a period of significant personal growth, a turning point that led to positive changes or a newly found purpose. So I'm just going to ask you to think of something. What was it? For some people, it was going to graduate school. So for some people, it's starting a family. For some people, it was caring for their adult, their parent in hospice, right? Was it stressful? All of these things, I'm betting that every single thing that had purpose, created a sense of purpose in your life, was also stressful, because the things that have meaning in our lives are stressful. Stress occurs when something we care about is at stake. The stress that you're experiencing means you care deeply about your craft and your profession. It means you care deeply about your students. It means you care deeply about your children and your families. There's a paradox. This is true even as countries. Countries with the highest levels of stress are also happier and healthier. Some of you may have said raising children gave you purpose. Raising children increases our daily stress. Have you noticed? And it increases the number of times you smile and laugh. Entrepreneurs report high levels of stress and higher levels of learning. Everything we do that's stressful has purpose and meaning. Stress is an inevitable consequence of engaging in roles and pursuing goals that feed our sense of purpose. And so feeling stressed then is a barometer for how engaged you are in the activities and relationships that you find personally meaningful. Meaning and stress are interwoven. And once we realize that, it can change how we experience the stress. Teaching has never been more stressful, right? But it's also never, ever been more meaningful. Strategy number 7 is, can we connect this meaning to our core values? Our meaning of things is rooted in very personally held values. And writing about our values is one of the most effective psychological interventions ever studied. And so I'm going to encourage you to do this on your own. And I'm also going to encourage you to do this with your students. Write a paragraph about the values that led you to choose to become an educator. For your students, write a paragraph about the values that you bring, about why coming to school is important for you. And then think about yesterday. How did those values show up in your teaching? Because the things that we value, if we don't look, we don't see that we are living those values. And never more important has it been now, whether if you're so focused on content and your value is to teach kids content, think of all the ways you adapted your teaching so they could learn that content. If it was to connect with kids and be a mentor for kids and help them navigate their childhood so they can be successful adults. How did you do that yesterday? How did you connect with them? It's showing up all over the place. But if we connect these things to our values, it has even more meaning, right? And the short-term impact of writing about values is, if you do this, you'll feel more powerful and in control. You'll feel prouder of what you do, and we feel stronger. That's what the research says. And for students, when they've done this, there's an increased GPA and improved health. They did this with Stanford students. And what they found on break, they said, the Stanford students, they're like, talk about what you did during your break, and then attach it to meaning. Writing about values helps students see meaning in their lives. Stressful experiences were no longer things to endure. They became an expression of their values. Never have our values and our meaning been more important now. And this is what gives us resilience. Strategy number 8, how do we plan for the long run? One of the challenges about this time is it's like a marathon without an ending, isn't it? Like, the marathons are hard enough, but could you imagine if you just had to run and you didn't know when this is going to end? This is one of the challenges, the big challenges that we face. There's an interesting article that I read about a sled dog musher in Alaska, and she wrote about how if um, um, at the beginning of every race, her dogs never know how long they're going to be running for. Some of these races are like hundreds of miles. The Iditarod is 1,000 miles, right? And so she said, if I let these dogs run for as long as they wanted to, they would run and they would just collapse. They couldn't make it. They'd run for maybe 50 or 60 miles. She said, but here's what we do. We race for 4 hours. And then after 2 hours, we stop religiously and we get warm and we eat and we rest. And then we go for another 4 hours and we do the same thing. Nobody wants to stop after that first 4 hours. Nobody wants to take care of themselves in that moment because everybody's so into the race. But she said, if we do this, we can run forever. So the interesting thing, she said, how long will this pandemic last? Right now, that's irrelevant. What matters is eating a nourishing meal, telling someone you love them, walking your dog, getting enough sleep. What matters is that to the degree you can, you make your own life sustainable every day. Ernest Hemingway said, continue slowly and wait for luck to change. That's our work. Strategy number 9 is, can we shift our focus from focusing on achievement? And I know that that's why we're all in school, right? Is to get kids to achieve. But what I want to say is this is our time to really focus on resilience. I was talking to a superintendent and I said, you know, I think in World War II in London, when they were bombing London, they closed schools for like 2 years. Those kids moved out to the country. And I don't think anybody looks back and says, wow, what a dumb generation that was. You know, the people in Scotland aren't saying, boy, those Londoners are sure dumb. Nobody said that. In fact, they too became the greatest generation. And she said, you know, it's so interesting. My father grew up in London in World War II, and they moved out to the country and they closed schools. He didn't go to school for about 2 years. And I said, well, what happened to him? And she said, well, he ended up moving to America and he got his PhD at the University of Rochester. And I would add that his daughter became the superintendent of a school. Things worked out okay, right? This is our time to teach resilience. Can we rethink trauma? This is the last strategy I'm going to give you today. We talk a lot about post-traumatic stress, but there's something called post-traumatic growth. People who experience adversity often see positive growth afterwards and a rise to a higher level of functioning than they had before. We don't often hear about this, do we? A traumatic event, it turns out, is not simply a hardship to be overcome. Instead, it's transformative. It becomes a dividing line in people's lives. And so what does post-traumatic growth give us? This is what the research says. We experience increased inner strength. We have an openness to new possibilities in life. Think about yourself as a teacher, all the new things you've had to do. We have closer and often deeper relationships with friends and family. We have an enhanced appreciation for life and a stronger sense of spirituality. All of these things are the results of trauma for many people. And even though we hear more about post-traumatic stress, post-traumatic growth is actually more common than post-traumatic stress. Resilience is learned. And you're teaching resilience now. When people are asked how they are coping with the biggest stresses in their lives, 82% say they are drawing on strength developed from past experiences. Kids are going to look back and be stronger because they coped with this so well, because they watched you cope with this so well. Eileen Zimmerman wrote, you can think of resilience as a set of skills that can be learned. Part of the skill building comes from exposure to very difficult but manageable experiences. Notice the language. It's the same language that Winnicott used 80 years ago, isn't it? Difficult but manageable experiences. The important thing is to differentiate between toxic optimism, which is everything's okay, there's nothing to worry about. No, what they say is we need to have tragic optimism. The ability to maintain hope and find meaning in life despite its inescapable pain and loss and suffering. This is not to diminish how hard this time is for us and our students and our families. This is not to diminish at all the pain and suffering. I hope you don't get that message. But the way people survive concentration camps, the way they have survived POW camps, all of this research from all of these times is the people who survived are the ones who are able to have hope and find meaning in this suffering. So much of this time we focused on all of the trauma associated, all of the challenges, all that's been taken away from us with coronavirus. But I also believe in this. Opportunity often comes disguised in the form of misfortune or temporary defeat. And I can't think of a time in my life when I've experienced more misfortune or felt more defeat than in the last year. Our world is turned upside down. It's, for many of us, our world and our families feel like they're in pieces. But here's the thing. We cannot helicopter parent our kids out of this stress, can we? And we cannot snowplow their path so that they don't experience the stress. Kids, for the first time in generations, are having to experience stress that we can't protect them from. And if we can rebuild from this time. If we can learn the lessons, if we can help them get through this time, and we can help them learn the lessons of what do we keep and what do we take away. We had a generation of kids who were overstressed, a generation of kids who were overscheduled, a generation of kids who were not, we were protecting from all of the stresses in their lives, but all of a sudden the world stopped and they were no longer overscheduled. And kids are sleeping longer. And kids, they're involved in less things, but they are also gaining meaning in other places. Families are having dinners together more often. The question is, we need to be intentional about what we keep from this time. What are we going to say that was causing our lives more pain, more heartache? What do we let go of and what do we keep? We are expecting and requiring greater levels of independence from our students, greater levels of resilience in our kids. We're coming together as a community, teachers and parents and kids. We are going to have a generation as a result of this that's more independent, that's more resilient and more community focused than ever. 10 years from now, what will children remember? I don't think they're going to say, boy, I didn't have as rigorous a punctuation lesson in 4th grade, and as a result, my essay for my MFA program at Michigan, I didn't capitalize the way I should have. They're not going to say that, are they? What they're going to say is the world turned us upside down, and I adapted, and my parents adapted, and my teachers. You wouldn't believe what my teachers did. Within 2 weeks, they completely changed how they did instruction for me. And we made it through, and it wasn't pretty, and it wasn't easy, but we adapted. And when we pull the curtain back on coronavirus, I think we're going to have a more innovative educational system. I think our families are going to be less stressed because we have realized in this time what is important. What will our classrooms look like in 2030? I don't think they're going to look like this. And part of it, a big part of it's going to be because we realize that at schools we can be more flexible than we ever imagined, and our kids can be more resilient and flexible than we ever imagined. 2 world wars, a pandemic, and a depression led to the greatest generation. Again, Ernest Hemingway said, the world breaks everyone, and afterwards some are strong at the broken places. We are going to be stronger, and our students are going to be stronger. And I believe this is going to be a generation that's more resilient. Last March, coronavirus came in and changed everything for us, didn't it? It wrote a whole different story than the story we were writing for our lives. The thing is, we get to write the next chapter. And I'm really excited about what we're going to write as educators and as parents. All right. Thank you so much for listening to all of that. If you have any questions, I'll share the PowerPoint, but if there's any way that I can be helpful in your journey through this, we've got a great team at Formative Psychological Services, so please feel free to reach out. I'm here, I'll answer any questions, Chris, that people have, but I guess I just want to say thank you for all you're doing, and thank you for giving me this time this morning.
Dr. Bolton, thank you. I think if we were all together, we'd be standing and applauding. So I just want to thank you for your message of hope and love. And I don't mean to simplify it, but those are the two words that come to mind. And I saw that resonate throughout your presentation, and that's really meaningful for us. And I gained a lot. So we do have about 10 minutes left, guys. And I know Erica has been taking in some questions. So I'm going to let Erica facilitate a few questions. We will end at 10 though, because I know you all have some things planned in your buildings. But Erica, questions that have come through that you want to take.
Yeah, if I can just really quickly, going back to one of the things that Dr. Bolton said, as a parent in the district, I want to thank you all so incredibly much for everything that you've done. Parents really do appreciate you very much. And I gotta take this opportunity to give a huge shout out to Mrs. Bicker and Mrs. Meisty over at Wiesbrook and Miss Maria at Jefferson Early Childhood Center. The Loyakino Nut House children are happy and they're thriving, and it wouldn't be that case without all of you. So thank you so much. Dr. Bolton, one of the questions that's come in is kind of talk a little bit about, like, I know you touched on some of the best practices and kind of managing stress, but there's a lot of things people are trying to balance right now in terms of assessments and getting through curriculum and personal life, and just talk a little bit about like how best to balance some of those things.
Yeah, first of all, I guess I just, Erica, you got me choked up in sharing that that level of appreciation. And so anyways, thank you for sharing that. The thing that I think that I guess the big message for me is the importance of being present, right? And in order to be present, we need to take care of ourselves first. And I know that and my hope is that as educational teams, you can take some time and figure out what are there things that we need to let go as educators. You know, I really believe that, and I'm not sure how well this will land, but I do think that we overemphasize homework, for instance. I would rather, the research isn't great on the connection of homework in elementary school to achievement. I think that we feel like it's our duty. I think that parents feel like if you don't give my kids homework, but there are things like that can we give homework for things that are essential, but maybe the homework assignment could be play a game with one of your family members. I'd much rather have kids going home and connecting with family and being able to become more regulated and not worried about homework. And that for a lot of kids, the homework battle at night is the hardest thing for parents and kids. And so we end up having kids walking into school that are more stressed. I do think that really figuring out with assessments and paperwork and other things, figuring out as teens, like what is most essential for now? This is the time, remember, that we're just trying to make it through. We're standing on that pier. We're not, everything's not going to come together well. I don't worry that if kids don't get certain amounts of instruction, that they're not going to be, that as a school district, you guys are going to make sure that they get everything they need by the time they're off to high school. I don't have any doubt about that. And so there's a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves, and it doesn't have to be a lot. You know, I gave you a 30-second break, right? It doesn't have to be a lot, but making sure you do make a priority of that time for yourself, whether it be getting a mindfulness exercise every day, whether it be taking a walk or putting things away at a certain time. So I hope I'm not sure how helpful that is, but I hope that that we realize what's important, and that's being present for one another and for our students.
Dr. Bolton, another question. Do you have any recommendations for good read alouds for books for elementary students that teach mindfulness, resilience, or regulation?
Gosh, I don't, because I've never done mindfulness with elementary school kids. But let me say this, I think that there's going to be a lot of resources. Where I got that mindfulness activity, for instance, was from Calm Classroom, and they're a Chicago-based organization. And my guess is that they would have some recommendations. But I think a good Google search would get you to mindfulness and children. Will get you where you need to go. And there's a lot of good stuff. The neat thing is, I think it all does the same stuff. The neat thing is that varying it can help kids feel engaged in kind of a neat way, right? So I like that one. I like the one I did because of how sensory it is. And after sitting for so long, you're needing to move. But for if you've got kids coming in from PE or wherever from outdoors or to start the day, it might be a different kind of activity, which is a quieter activity where they're doing a breathing activity. But there's tons of resources out there. I'm sorry I don't have one that's particularly good for this.
Another question came through about reversing the impact of trauma, in particular during this time.
That's really good. That's another talk. And by the way, I'm seeing a whole lot of resources. Thank you for putting those resources in. So your colleagues are answering that last question much better than I did. So thank you. So here's the thing, prior to this, my speaking and professional development has really been about creating trauma responsive school communities. And what happens, and I'll cut to the chase for this, is that when we are connected to the people around us and when we are emotionally regulated, all of that stress response that we talked about, all the fight, flight, or freeze, our heart rate and the glucose that we churn out from our pancreas, our pupils dilate, all of these things are happening. Our intestinal system shuts down. All of these things happen under stress. Kids who've experienced trauma, most kids, when they walk into school, they feel good about themselves. They've got home lives that are pretty good. They come into school and their stress response can go down. For many kids, their stress response because of the trauma continues to create physical responses in them that by the time they are young adults and adults, when their heart rates don't go down, that means they're more likely to have cardiac issues later in life. Does this make sense? Because it never gets a break. So what happens in schools is if we can give them 30 hours of that break, right? If you can give them 30 hours of a connected and regulated classroom right now, that means their stress response goes down. That means their heart isn't beating as much. That means their lungs, their breathing is different. It's deeper and slower. And as a result, they're able to, it buffers and changes the impact of stress and can reverse the impact of trauma on their lives. So that's like a 5-hour talk I put into like 3 minutes, but I hope that gives a sense that when kids are feeling connected and calm in your classroom, the fact that their body is slowing down and quieter is going to help all kids, not just the kids with trauma, but helps all kids.
I think one last question that came through is talk about a little bit more about how including parents more in showing up, especially if they're just barely surviving themselves.
Yeah, at North Shore Academy, we had the luxury, but we had kids who were all struggling in school. That's how they got to North Shore Academy, was they needed a private, it's public placement, but they needed another placement. And one of the game changers, we had a parent consultant who came in. She's a parent and what she said was, you need to hear their story. Because we were often assuming things that because we were getting these hostile emails and other things. And she said, just do some listening and start listening to what their hopes and their fears are for their child. And I think that when you've got a parent who's struggling, one of the things that we found was our impulse is to avoid those moments. But what she said and what we really found was the parents who cause the greatest deal of anxiety for us as educators, when we invited them to hear their story and just to be able to hear their story, all of a sudden, once they understood that we knew their story, they didn't feel like they needed to do the email every day to convince us that we weren't teaching them the right way. Once we were able to say, oh, we get it. And maybe when we send a note home and they're worried about how much homework they're getting or they're worried about X, Y, and Z, we can include the fact that this is what we worked on today, whatever that may be. But listening to their story is so important. And I do think that one of the interesting things about this time during remote learning was we were able to see into their lives and they were able to see into ours. And in that way, you could see for kids who maybe struggled, you could see a more chaotic home life and realize, oh my gosh, when they're coming to school, look at what they're coming from. And now I understand why they're so jazzed up when they walk in the school building. So that's, I'm not sure if that gets at it, Erica, but I do think that figuring out for those, we've got orchid parents just like we've got orchid kids. And for those orchid parents, how can we really reach out and listen to their story? And if they'll tell us, it's amazing what can happen in that moment.
Dr. Bolton, on behalf of our entire district, we've been blessed this morning to have you speak and give us your wisdom and knowledge. And for all of our staff that are on a part of this, I hope you have a great day, a restful weekend, and have an opportunity to take the lessons we've learned today and implement them in your own lives, in your classrooms and with your kids, and we'll continue to move forward. So I just want to thank everybody. And again, thank you, Dr. Bolton, and have a great day.
Thanks so much for having me.